Two big by-election defeats for the Conservatives, two big wins for Labour. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary Liz Kendall, Conservative Party Chairman Richard Holden, The Mirror's political editor John Stevens and political correspondent at The Sun, Noah Hoffman. On today's programme.
I do hereby declare that Genevieve Victoria Kitchen, also known as Jen Kitchen, of the Labour Party, is duly elected.
I do hereby declare that Damien Egan is duly elected.
Two big by-election wins for Labour, but Sir Keir Starmer is playing it cool.
As every football fan knows, you don't win the league by a good win in February.
Rishi Sunak puts on a brave face.
We've got work to do to show people that we are delivering on their priorities, and that's what I'm absolutely determined to do.
And Tory concern as third place in both contests goes to Reform UK.
There is a lot of common ground between the Conservative Party and the Reform Party, and therefore we need to make sure that we appeal to those voters.
We'll hear from Reform Party leader Richard Tice. Plus, we'll have the best analysis from election guru Sir John Curtis. So, no doubt about it, a very bad night for the Conservatives. I suppose the big question is just how bad is it? Let's start with the chairman of the Conservative Party. This is a disaster for your party just a few months from a general election, isn't it?
Look, it's a disappointing result. Obviously, every election I want to be out there and winning it. But yeah, a tough night for the Conservatives. I'd also say, though, you've seen turnouts significantly lower than we've seen at the general elections. And people know they're not electing a government at a by-election. And I've been out on the doors in both of those constituencies 4 times over the last few weeks. And, you know, it's a tough time. But I think with the Prime Minister's clear message there, that we've started to make real progress on things like tackling inflation, on reducing the number of crossings through the illegal crossings. I think we need to make more progress on those areas. And also, now we've got inflation coming down, look, where we can in a sustainable manner, start cutting tax for working people as well. We've stood behind them during the pandemic, during those huge energy price rises. We've seen £500 billion of support has gone in. But I think people on the other side now, now that those things are starting to ease slightly.
Is this, one Tory source has said to the BBC today, this is an extinction-level event. Do you think that's the case?
Well, I don't think so. I think these are by-elections and they need to be seen in the context in which they're being fought as well.
It's not a one-off, is it?
Well, no, but let's have a look at the, you know, the context in which both of them are fought. We had an MP stand down in Kingswood and another MP who over in Wellingborough had obviously been recall petitioned. You know, those aren't ideal circumstances for any party to fight a by-election under either.
OK, Liz Kendall, is Sir Keir Starmer right that he's not been complacent and actually just a big win in February isn't enough?
I mean, he's right to say these were extremely good results for the Labour Party, and I am very proud at how far we have come and how much Keir has changed the Labour Party. I never would have believed we'd been in this situation, that grim morning after 2019. But politics is volatile, and in order to win the general election, we'd have to have a bigger swing to us even than we had in 1997.
But you think it's possible?
We have done.
You must think it's possible.
We have a
after
chance.
this.
We have a chance. And let me just come back to what's really happened here. I mean, one of your own councillors told the BBC this morning what people were worried about was the cost of living and the state of the high street in Wellingborough. And a voter, Mr Hadley, I spoke to, yes, Mr Hadley, if you're listening, it was me, yesterday in Wellingborough, said to me simply, it's rubbish. You know, the working man has suffered under the Tories. It's that simple. And you can't escape the reality, which is that people feel nothing is working You know, they can't make ends meet, they can't get to see a GP or a dentist. And the Tories can have this whole internal debate about reform and whether they should do a deal with them or move more towards the right, as I'm sure we'll discuss later. But they can't escape the reality, which is that the public feels nothing's working and they want change.
OK, John, extinction level event, or I think the source also said a slow motion car crash, neither good things, obviously. Do you think it's that bad for the Tories?
Well, I think the striking thing today is that this feels pretty normal. It doesn't feel like an extraordinary event. We'll look at the bar charts, no doubt, in a bit, and the incredible swing from the Tories to Labour. I think it was 28.5% in Wellingborough. That's the second biggest swing since the World War. And it doesn't feel like the world is kind of caving in. It feels pretty normal because we are starting to see a picture here, and Richard talks about the specific circumstances of these seats. But this government has now lost more seats in by-elections than any government in history, and it is starting to build this picture. And I'm sure Richard will say we heard from other Tories out there this morning that there's no enthusiasm for Keir Starmer. But I think the real problem for the Tory party at the moment is there is little enthusiasm at all for Rishi Sunak. And as much as Richard says they are delivering on the people's priorities, when you look at things like the economy, in the last year, our economy grew by 0.1%, and that is pathetic. And that is really hitting people in their pockets.
No, do you agree with that? I mean, it's worse than that for the Tories, isn't it? It's not just that there's no enthusiasm for Rishi Sunak, actually rejecting him and the party in big numbers.
Yeah, and I think, as Liz and John put very eloquently, at the end of the day, this comes down to the cost of living. People are just not seeing more money in their pocket. They're going to the supermarket and struggling with inflated prices. Public services are an absolute mess. And the Tories have, and in the last budget, offered tax cuts, which is always nice. But I'm just thinking, even from a personal perspective, the tax cut that I'm going to get is completely wiped out by a rent rise that my landlord has given me. When I tried to go to the GP the other day, I was told I have to wait 3 weeks. And I'm someone who, you know, is relatively comfortable, and I'm finding it really annoying, and so is the public, and they're punishing the Tories at the ballot box.
Let's let a quick response to that.
Well, yeah, let's look at public services across the board. We've got more money going into the NHS than ever before, per head in real terms. When I was last on this show...
But it's not helping, is it?
Well, I'll just say, when I was last on this show, I sat next to Wes Streeting, and he wasn't saying that we should go any further in that, but he was saying that we obviously have to do some of the reforms that we're putting through. When we're talking about extra police officers, for example, to tackle crime, we're looking at record numbers of police officers now across the country. There is cash going into our public services. When you look at our record since 2010 on things like education, we're now seeing 89% of kids going to good or outstanding schools, up from under 2/3 under the last Labour government.
Everything's okay, are you?
No, I'm not, but I'm saying we're making significant progress in a lot of these areas. Whether you look at employment stats, even since the pandemic, we've got 80,000 more people in work than before the pandemic started. So there are some good signs there, and also I do accept totally what actually is being said by the rest of the panel. People are feeling pressure in terms of inflation. We've seen food inflation drop for the first time, actually negative inflation, deflation, in this last month's stats. I want to see that go further. We can only do that, though, with a sensible economic plan for the future. And that's something that I don't see we're getting from the Labour Party at the moment either, where we've got that £28 billion. They've wrote back on the number, but we don't really understand, but they're still committed to all of the policies there. And actually, I think we need some honesty from the opposition as well.
We will be asking Liz about that in a second. Let's just quickly look at the details of those by-election results. Let's start with Wellingborough, which, of course, a Labour gain, as we were hearing. Jen Kitchen there with 13,844 votes. The Conservatives in a pretty poor second, and Reform UK with almost 4,000 votes, something that's no doubt alarming a lot of Conservative MPs. Let's now look at the share of the vote, 45.9% there for Labour, and again, Reform UK 13%. Slightly higher, I think, than the national polls have been suggesting. The share change, where you can see very clearly who is up and who is down. Labour up almost 20%, Conservatives down a whopping 37.6%, Reform UK up 13%, and then that all-important swing, Conservative to Labour, a massive 28.5%. Let's speak to Sir John Curtice about all of this now to put it in some kind of perspective. I mean, it looks like in this particular result, a really great result for Labour.
Yes, and even more clearly, a disastrous result for the Conservatives. It's not only the second biggest swing from Conservative to Labour in post-war by-election history, it's actually the biggest fall in Conservative support recorded in any by-election that the party was trying to defend. Meanwhile, at the same time, another record is that Reform have now put in their best by-election performance ever in this relatively Eurosceptic constituency. Oh, by the way, the 19-point increase in the Labour vote is also in the top 10 of Labour increases. So always round, a terrible result for the Conservatives and a very good result for Labour. Of course, it may be true that the reason why it was quite so bad was to do with the circumstances surrounding both why the vacancy arose in the first place, i.e. the finding that Peter Bone, a rather well-known backbench Conservative MP, had been judged to have bullied a member of staff, and that eventually led to the by-election. But then perhaps also the fact that it was his partner who then stood as the candidate, which perhaps was not necessarily a sign of atonement. Now, how far that matters, who knows? But the point is the Conservative vote was already so vulnerable that with that extra pressure, I mean, it's little short of a collapse in Conservative support.
OK, let's have a look at that other by-election then. Kingswood, which, again, of course, a Labour gain. Damien Egan there, 11,176 votes. The Conservative second. Reform UK third with 2,578. Of course, pretty similar to the actual majority there for Labour. Let's look at the share of the vote. Again, you can see a little bit closer here between Labour and the Conservatives. Reform on about just over 10%. The share change, very similar pattern here. Labour up 11.5%, the Conservatives down 21%, and Reform UK just over 10%. And then Conservative to Labour swing, not quite as big, 16.4%. And John, on this one, is there any sign here that Labour should be at all worried about this? I mean, this is a sort of seat that they would expect to win, I guess.
Well, I mean, on the one hand, if we were still going to fight the next election on the current constituencies, Kingswood would be one of those seats that was down as a Labour must win, and Labour have won. That said, yep, the swing is, by the standards of recent by-elections, rather low, though maybe that's not saying very much. Slightly more, perhaps, perceptive was Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg's comment that Labour's performance in Kingswood didn't match what New Labour managed to achieve between 1997 and 2005, although it should also be said they did manage to match their performance during that era in Wellingborough. But, I mean, again, it's another constituency in which Reform are doing well at around the 10% in the national opinion poll. So both by-elections are seemingly indicating that Reform are now a significant competitor for votes in the electoral firmament in the course of the next 9 months.
Yeah, interesting. Liz Kendall, first of all, on that. Are you concerned about, first of all, Reform UK and, you know, not just taking necessarily from the Conservatives, and also those voters who've stayed at home? I know it's a by-election, but after everything that's happened, are you concerned that there are people who still aren't persuaded by Labour?
So I think that Damien Egan in his acceptance speech was absolutely right to say people want change, but they've had the hope kind of sucked out of them. And I'm under no illusions about how hard we're going to have to work to convince people change is coming, change is possible, and we have a plan to do it. I mean, you know, it is the hope that kills you in the end if that's not fulfilled. And that's why I'm sure we'll come on to what we were discussing earlier about our Green Prosperity Plan. I'm very proud that Keir Starmer has levelled with the public about what we can and cannot afford and what we will and won't do. Because I don't want to look my constituents in the face and promise the world that I can't deliver. I think people appreciate it if you're honest with them. So I know, you know, Keir used a sort of footballing analogy earlier today. You know, you don't win the league in February. I'm more of a runner myself. And, you know, politics is a marathon, not a sprint. And you've got to get your pace right, you've got to speed up at the end, and that's what we're going to have to do over the next 6 months.
So, Richard, for the Conservatives, I mean, we are getting closer to that general election, marathon, not a sprint. But, I mean, can Rishi Sunak turn this round? What else can he do now? He's pulled a few levers. Nothing's working.
I think we're moving in a good direction on the economy. We've
just gone into a recession.
But in terms of both the employment numbers this week, in terms of inflation this week, I think those are solid. I think on the other side, you know, Liz says that Keir Starmer has levelled with the British people about his Green Prosperity Plan. I mean, at the moment, all he's done is take the number off it, rather than actually be honest, because all of those pledges, which he said he'd do by 2030, are still in there. And so it'd be really nice to see actually him levelling with the British public and being honest that basically is saying, well, we might not borrow, but we're going to have to do something else in order to achieve that. Because unless you're going to totally reverse on those policies, then, you know, what is Labour actually doing apart from being unclear with the British public about where it's going to raise taxes?
Must be able to come back on that. You know, the truth is that there is private sector investment that can be leveraged in to create those industries and jobs of the future, to do the offshore wind, the carbon capture and storage. That we know that it is by that partnership with business. We'll have our National Wealth Fund and GB Energy, which will be the tool that will do that. And I actually think it's right to say to people, look, it's now costing £70 billion more to service our debt than when we first made that plan. And just as families have had to change the plan because you crashed the economy, we are being honest with people about the changes we're making and what we can deliver. And I think the public appreciates that.
I think when it comes down to it, you know, we are leveraging huge amounts of green investment, and we've not just got the first, second, third and fourth, but we're about to start the fifth largest offshore wind site in Europe. That's huge amounts of that happening in places like Teesside, with Mayor Ben Houchen, you know, really driving forwards green economic change there. But Liz talks about wanting to leverage in investment, but won't tell us how much money Labour government will put in to leverage it.
Listen, I think the public watching this will know when they look around them the state of the economy. And if you, in politics, if you don't even recognise a problem, which is that our growth has been completely stagnant, and you can't have a plan to put it right. And that, I'm afraid, is that all of the politics whirling around that, the economy hasn't grown. We've got a plan to do that. You might not like our plan, but we have one. It's not yours, and unless you recognise the scale of change that is required, you're never going to get the. We have been.
Let me just bring in Sir John Curtis. He has to go, so he's a very busy man. Sir John, looking at the historical perspective here, has any party ever turned it round, a deficit like this, being this far behind, as the polls suggest?
Well, I think so far as by-elections are concerned, we should certainly compare by-elections with by-elections. Now, I've got slightly good news for the Conservatives. It was remarked earlier that no government had lost as many by-elections as the Conservatives have done in this parliament. That's not true. Harold Wilson managed to lose 13 between 1966 and 1917. I'm afraid I'm old enough to remember many of those dramatic losses. But what is true, and contrary to the Conservative narrative, oh, look, governments are always losing by-elections, no government has lost as many by-elections as this government has done since the 1992 to 97 parliament. And that's allowing for the fact that the Conservatives did win in Hartlepool. Equally, no government has been losing by-elections so spectacularly as the Conservatives have been doing this parliament since the 1992 to 97 parliament. And what we certainly have to say, therefore, is that, of course, history is not bound to repeat itself, but the Conservative Party is going to be able to is going to have to do what John Major was unable to do in 1997, which is to turn things around towards the last minute. Again, the comment today from the Prime Minister that, you know, governments lose by-elections in mid-term. We're not in mid-term anymore. We're towards the end of this Parliament. It's the time when governments should be beginning to recover. There is no sign of any Conservative recovery, either in the opinion polls or in these by-elections.
OK, so John, thank you very much indeed, and just respond to that, if you would.
Look, I mean, we've had I'm not denying these have been tough results, but I mean, when we look at the by-elections, you know, even in Mid Beds, which was gained by the Labour Party in a recent by-election. You know, that's even their own candidate there, their own newly elected MP clearly doesn't think it's going to be repeated in a general election because he's abandoning the seat and trying to find somewhere else to stand for Labour. So I think we need to view them in that context as well. I'm not saying it's not tough, but we have got a clear plan for the future. I think it's moving in the right direction in multiple different areas. And I just want to take up a little bit of what Liz has said. You know, this idea that we're performing worse than lots of other countries is just simply untrue. You can see inflation has happened around the world. Interest rates have risen right across the world, whether it's in the Eurozone or the US. We've actually, growing out of the G7, we're number 3 behind the US and Canada in terms of growth since both 2010 and since the pandemic. So I'd be really interested to know, when it comes down to it, what are the numbers behind Labour's policy proposal, because without being honest with people, without putting numbers on it, how can anybody possibly judge them about the future?
I'm really keen to fight this election on the economy, because what businesses will tell me is that they need stability, not like the chaos that you have released, including Liz Truss, who's now back on the scene. They want to have proper partnership with government to invest in the jobs of the future and to have the skills that they need. That's something businesses are desperate for, and they actually need reform. And let me come back to these employment figures. Actually, the new employment figures out this week showed that we now have record numbers of people out of work due to long-term sickness. That is costing them and the taxpayer far more. You don't have a plan to put that right. You don't have a plan to reform skills. And why are businesses saying we are the only party that's even on the pitch in terms of a growth plan? And I'll tell you why, because they look at the experience of what has happened over the last decade, and you are not saying anything different. So I say bring on an election which is based on the economy. And I tell you why. Because Keir has changed the Labour Party, that people now trust us more on the economy. We think that is hard won, and we're going to keep fighting for that. That businesses say are working with us. That is an indication of how much he's changed the Labour Party. And I think a clear message to the country, we can change the country too.
We know that under the previous Labour government, they left unemployment 500,000 higher. Every single majority Labour government has always left unemployment higher than when it started. We've seen a million fewer people unemployed under this government. But you promised
growth, though. You did promise growth, didn't you? And that's not what's happening.
I think we will get there. We've obviously had to deal with the inflationary issues at the moment. Down from 11.1%.
Why should people believe you after 14 years?
Now down to 4%.
Why should they believe you?
Because there's a million more people in work. You left 500,000 more unemployed after 13 years of a Labour government. And you talk about your plan for the future. I'm just looking at some of the interesting things around apprenticeships recently. We've seen a real transformation in what we want to do with apprenticeships. Really high quality apprenticeships now available in 70% of industries.
Can I just tell you what the boss of Sainsbury's told me a couple of weeks ago?
I'm happy to listen to this, but I want to respond to it.
He said, they had 14 million taken for the apprenticeship levy. They'd only been able to spend just over $1 million. Now, he wants to see change because he wants to make sure his people have got the skills for the future.
Response to that, and then we're going to move on.
It's really important. What the Labour Party's position is on apprenticeships is basically to degrade apprenticeships as they are now from what we've. No, it's not. It's absolutely true. It's to weaken them so that in the interest of big business, not in the interests of either the learners or in the interests of productivity in our economy.
It's and to I think work with businesses to make apprenticeships.
Okay, let's leave there. We need to move on.
It will halve the number of apprenticeships.
We've got a whole general election campaign coming up where we can.
I think it's a really dangerous policy which hasn't been thought through by the Labour Party.
Let's leave it there for a second. Can the Tories turn this around?
I think it's really difficult for them, and I think when people like Richard make the argument that the economy is now turning in the right direction, in the week we went into a recession, it's going to be even harder for them because people at home know how they feel. They know that their mortgages or their rent, like Noah, has gone through the roof, and they know that the prices in shops have gone up and up and up. So I think, as Noah said, the Tory party can offer whatever tax cuts they want in a budget. I think that won't make the difference to normal people.
No, do you think that, that does look like the way it's going to go, that there could be some more tax cuts coming in the budget? Is that going to be enough?
I think tax cuts are always welcome. Is it going to be enough? Probably not, because as the we've all been acknowledging on this panel, people just aren't feeling like their quality of life has gone up. They're really struggling to access some really basic public services. The NHS is an absolute mess and things don't seem to be getting better. And I think the main argument that the Tories are really going to struggle with, this sort of killer argument from Labour, is you've been in power for 14 years. So, you know, you can put out excuses, you can put out justifications, and there are some very valid ones. The pandemic, you know, was a very difficult issue that government had to grapple with, that had economic repercussions. There are, you know, global issues, Ukraine, etc. But at the end of the day, the big question that the Tories are going to have to answer on the doorstep is, you've been here for 14 years, why aren't things getting better? And why should I trust you that going forward they will get better?
OK, let's go to Wellingborough now, and my colleague Henry Zeffman, our chief political correspondent, who's been waiting patiently to speak to us. And Henry, are you detecting that Conservatives there were expecting such a resounding defeat?
No, I think they were expecting a defeat, and I think Labour were expecting a victory. But people on both sides seem a little surprised by the scale of it, as do people I've been chatting to here in Wellingborough this morning. Plenty of them change their minds. In fact, more often it's that I meet someone who voted Conservative at the last election, actually the last several elections, but didn't vote at all yesterday. But all of them seem very struck by the scale of the swing. And it seems to reflect a real mood of frustration among the voters I've been speaking to here. National issues, yes, also local issues. I've rarely heard the word potholes mentioned to me so many times after a by-election. Things like that seem to have really affected the result here, as well as the national picture, which of course has come up a lot.
OK, Henry Zeffman, thank you very much indeed. Let's have a look now at the performance of Reform UK. Of course, lots of Conservative MPs very worried about the impact that they might have come the general election. We're joined from our Westminster newsroom by their leader, Richard Tice. Thank you for joining us today. This was a very decent performance by your party, but I mean, it's not as good as the peak of UKIP, is it? I mean, if you look at the result of in 2015, almost 20% UKIP polled in Wellingborough. You're not getting quite to that stage, are you?
Well, we've been only going for 3 years and we're delighted with these two results. They're our best by-election results and they've been achieved almost from a standing start just a few weeks ago. And it's a recognition that actually more and more people are becoming aware of Reform. It takes time to build a brand and they're saying, actually, yes, I like what you stand for. I don't think there's any difference between the two main parties. So we've made real progress, and I repeat, we're going to stand everywhere across England, Scotland and Wales. I was fascinated listening to the discussion there about growth. I mean, the Prime Minister said earlier in the week that, essentially the plan was working. Well, we're not working. We're in recession, thanks to the Tory policies. We've got the greatest decline in living standards per head, I think, since record began in the mid-50s. You can't grow an economy if you have record taxes, record government spending, much of which is wasteful, record nanny state regulations because you haven't taken advantage of the Brexit economy, mass low-skilled immigration, and the multi-trillion cost of the absurdity of net zero. You cannot grow an economy. I predicted this a month ago. Unfortunately, there's no difference between the two main parties about how they're going to actually grow the economy. We're setting out clear plans how you do that. I haven't heard anything from Labour about why their plans are any different from the Conservatives that's going to create some growth, because that's what people want.
Right, well, they're both here listening to this. Do you want to respond, Richard Holden?
I mean, what plan of the Reform Party come up with? I mean, we've seen them poll just over 10% in two by-elections. I remember being in Rochester and Clacton during the mid 2010s, where we saw very significant votes in that direction. I don't really know what they're offering the country.
But he's after your voters, and it looks like quite a lot of them are persuaded.
Well, I mean, let's look at the the numbers there. As I say, I remember the mid-2010s. It was quite a different place. And I'd just say, Richard Tice and his colleagues have basically gone out there and said they want the Conservatives to lose as many seats as possible at the election by voting Reform. They know they're not going to win seats. You can see that from the results actually actually there on the ground. But they will cost the Conservative seats if people vote for them. So a vote for Richard Tice is a vote to put Keir Starmer into number 10. I'm sure that's what he's after. That's what he's told us he's after. I mean, at least he's been honest about that, I suppose. But, you know, when it comes to their broader policy platform, I'm really not sure what they stand for.
I mean, that's right, isn't it, Richard? Tice, you've said that you're after Conservative voters. How are they going to feel, do you think, if they vote for you and wake up with Sir Keir Starmer in government?
Look, the Conservative Party don't have the right, they don't own the philosophy of conservatism, they don't have the right to prevent anybody else coming into the democratic process, coming up with better ideas as to how we're going to try and get the economy growing and protect our British culture and you know, make the country work for British people. That's the key thing. That's why people are attracted to us. What I'm saying is there's no difference between the two main parties. They're the party of high tax, high regulation, mass immigration, pro-net zero. You cannot grow an economy on that basis. And people, I think more and more people are beginning to realise it.
Is that true?
Well, and it's obviously untrue. You can see what we've done in the last few months.
You're not growing, Richard. We're in recession, Richard.
After shouting at me, it'd be really interesting. I mean, obviously, Richard's not talking about his own plans because clearly they're not even worked through yet. But what would be really interesting to see, I think, is that policy platform they put forwards and what the costs of that would be. What I would say, on the other hand, though, is it's quite clear, as Richard Tice has said previously, that he just wants to cost the Conservatives as many seats as possible in the next election, which will help put Keir Starmer into number 10. We can see exactly that from the by-election results. You can see that in the numbers themselves in Kingswood. I mean, if that's what he wants to do, fair enough. But he's not actually interested in winning the next election, not interested really in winning seats. He's just interested in costing the Conservatives votes, which I can understand that. I mean, he's shaking his head, but I thought those quotes were from his own party activists.
Richard Tice, you have been quoted as saying that, and your activists have as well, that you are after Conservative votes, and you do know that what the consequences of that might be. I mean, what is your policy platform here?
Well, first of all, this is a medium-term project. It's not a one-election project. You cannot reward utter failure over 14 years with a party that's broken Britain with more incumbency. They have to be punished. It is as simple as that. And I think the British people are going to punish them, and punishing them, frankly, with every by-election. It's just absurd to suggest that the people should continue to trust a party that's betrayed all its promises. We gave you an 80-seat majority back in December 19, and you've utterly blown it. You've messed up, and frankly, you should just stand aside.
I mean, that's quite total nonsense. I've already mentioned the huge amounts of education reform we've done over the last 14 years, you know, transforming vocational education as well. When you look at jobs in the economy, 1 million more people off the unemployment rolls, 4 million overall more in work, absolutely transformed things like universal credit to ensure that people are always better off in work than not, really delivering on some of those Brexit benefits with new deals around the world. Now, Richard can put his head in his hands, but I think we all know what he's really interested in, which is trying to stop the Conservatives winning and putting Keir Starmer into number 10. He said it himself. He says it time after time. He's not interested.
Liz, he's accusing you of being no different from the Tories.
I mean, look, what we're going to see over the coming months is some people like Richard in an argument with Reform, others wanting to do a deal with them or to merge with them. And, you know, I think that this convulsion we're seeing in the Conservative Party is going to intensify as people become more and more, Tory MPs become more and more worried with their seats. But what the public wants to see is a party focused on the things they're concerned about. And their experience day to day, as we've heard, shows things aren't working, they're paying more, they're getting less. And I just think that is a little snapshot there of one part of the Tory party in a row with the Reform. Another part will want to do a deal with them. And our job as the Labour Party is to keep focused on where the British public are, that we serve them and we need a plan to meet their needs. And that is what we are going to do over the coming months.
And Richard Holden, are you...
It's no rich of Liz to talk about that when the Labour Party has been having a massive row with itself over anti-Semitism over the last week. You know, Keir Starmer couldn't make a decision on what to do with their anti-Semitic racist candidate on Sunday. It took dozens of Labour MPs apparently to drag him into a new position.
We're going to talk about Rochdale in 1 second.
So long
Can I just ask
with an MP who didn't just bully people, as John Curtis said, but exposed himself to people. So I'm not taking any lessons from you.
So that's Peter Bone you're talking about, who had a recall, he was recalled and now he's lost his seat.
That was an independent parliamentary process.
I don't want to hear
It's quite interesting that back in back in October, there was clearly a meeting where senior Labour figures were present, including prospective parliamentary candidates. Not one of them spoke up about the anti-Semitism there until a national newspaper exposed it just a week ago. And actually, I want to know, under the skin, just how much Labour has changed since
let Liz respond to that accusation.
About that.
I mean, that's complete nonsense, Liz.
It isn't. He took a very difficult decision.
No, he took one decision and then he had to change it. That's not decisiveness.
That is not. He took a
He
was decisive.
He wasn't decisive.
He has dealt with this, and he has dealt with this problem.
And this is talking about the former Labour candidate in the Rochdale by-election, which is coming up at the end of the month, Asa Ali, and Labour have withdrawn their support from him. And they did so, within, I think, 36 hours, I think it was.
Well, I think we know that it was on Saturday that there was quite Saturday lunchtime, I believe, the newspaper went to them. They then had one position, sent out Liz's colleagues to go and defend having this anti-Semitic racist candidate, and then it was only the day later that they actually decided to change yet again under huge media pressure.
So Keir Starmer has said that he has changed the Labour Party, that he has rooted out anti-Semitism. Are you concerned that actually there is still a problem within your party that hasn't been dealt with?
I think that he took I've been in politics, in and around politics now for my sins for about 30 years, and I think he took an unprecedented decision to say that after the nomination papers had got in, that there would no longer be a Labour candidate.
But should it have got to that phase? Why was there not work done beforehand? Because now just let me finish a second, those voters in Rochdale are now left without the chance to vote for a candidate who is being supported by the Labour Party.
And because he acted decisively when that new information came through, and it is an unprecedented decision. And I think he has shown unbelievable courage in rooting this problem out in the Labour Party. And again, if you had told me the morning after that grim 2019 election that we would have come so far, not just in dealing with anti-Semitism, but making us trusted again with people's money, because it's not our money, it's their money, being trusted with national security, being patriotic and loving this country and backing NATO, I wouldn't have believed it.
But you're giving away a safe Labour seat, aren't you? You're giving away a safe Labour seat.
And that shows the nature of how important and unprecedented the decision was. And I am very proud that he took that decision because it was the right thing to do.
You say about voters trusting you. Are you concerned about Muslim voters moving away from your party? Your colleague, the Shadow Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, said last week there's been a loss of trust from British Muslims in her party over its position on the Israel-Gaza war.
You know, I see that this, what's happening in the Middle East has been one of the most polarising issues that I have ever seen and dealt with, certainly as a constituency MP, with people feeling on both sides more than just very strongly that it is an existential crisis for Jews in the state of Israel, but also for Palestinians too. And I believe my job as a person with some semblance of political leadership is to try and find the things that we have in common during this difficult time. I am really worried about that, not just in the Middle East, but here, that we need to focus on our common humanity and common suffering. And that is what I believe political leadership should be like in the months and years ahead.
That Rochdale by-election will take place at the end of the month. It should really have been a safe Labour seat, and it now won't be. I mean, how damaging is it, do you think, for Sir Keir Starmer? I mean, he's had a very difficult week with policy proposals and with the way he's dealt with this. How do you think he's dealt with it?
Yeah, I think that there is some fair criticism that there was a bit of slowness on the part of the Labour Party to respond to this. And you can understand that part of that was because of this situation where it was too late to change the candidate. And I think the other reluctance was, who do you get instead in Rochdale? Do you end up with someone like George Galloway managing to get through and getting a foothold and getting into Parliament again? So, yeah, I think they could have responded quicker, but you can understand why they might have been reluctant to do that.
Do you think it's harmful to Sir Keir Starmer? I mean, of course, when he came in, he said he was going to root out anti-Semitism. And then if it seems to be that he isn't managing to do that, do you think voters will look at that and say that's a broken promise?
Yeah, potentially, because he categorically did not deal with this issue well. With the greatest of respect to Liz, I think he did take way too long. And now we're in this situation where, you know, there's a real prospect that George Galloway, who, in my opinion, is a very, very nasty politician, may end up in the Commons off the back of a real failure of Labour's vetting process. What went wrong there? You know, there are a few other candidates, our lobby colleague Paul Waugh, who they probably missed a trick there, not having him in there. What went wrong with the vetting? What Azhar Ali said was categorical. Talking about Jewish media power is a classic of the anti-Semitism genre. It's just indisputable that that is unacceptable racism. Keir Starmer genuinely cares about this issue. I'm not questioning that. He really wants to root it out. But there is still a way to go. And why did we have this mess in Rochdale?
And you can see a full list of candidates for that by-election, which is happening on the 29th of February. Just quickly, can I ask you about voter apathy? I mean, I know these are by-elections. The turnout is obviously lower. But do you think there's an element here that people aren't totally enthusiastic about Labour yet, that they're actually turning away from all politics?
Well, I think there's also a particular problem here that we are now in a general election year, and I think psychologically for people, they might think, well, what's the point of voting someone in as an MP and then we're going to have another election in a few months' time? And they may be feeling, well, I might want to change who the MP is, but I won't be getting to change who's in number 10, which is obviously going to be a motivating factor for people to go out there. And I think particularly in Wellingborough, where that's not in Wellingborough, in Kingswood, where that seat just won't exist at the next election. It's been ripped apart in different ways. I mean, the Tories couldn't even find a candidate who wanted to stand there and then stand again at the general election. I think that showed...
John, because obviously the seat's not going to exist.
Right, but your candidate who's going to stand in the similar seat didn't want to stand in that by-election because it's a very pointless election for many people, that many people have got busy lives and thought, well, why should I bother to go out and vote?
Are you going to stand as a candidate?
Yeah, I'm hoping to. We'll have to see if somewhere takes me.
So your seat's also
my seat is very similar to Kingswood, actually.
Right.
It gets chopped up, and mine gets chopped up into 4. But yeah, I'm hoping to find somewhere which will take me. But until that point, until the day of the general election, I will be fighting very hard and continuing to do so. I'm visiting twice last week, back up to North West Durham to see the people in Consett, Crook and Weardale and all about the place. And we'll be campaigning for the candidates who will be taking the various different bits of that seat.
Is Rishi Sunak's position safe after these by-election defeats?
Look, I think the Prime Minister's, absolutely he is. I think he's got a clear direction of travel he wants to go in. I think you can see, and I think this discussion actually around turnout's quite an interesting one, because I think your initial question was the right one. Have people really made that decision to switch to Labour? Well, you can see in Kingswood, Labour got 5,000 fewer people actually turned out to vote for them than they did at the general election, which I think shows perhaps a little bit of a lack of enthusiasm. I'm not saying there were good results for the Conservative Party at all, but I think there is all to play for over the next few months. And I think that's, and in the interest of the British people, we need to ensure that we make those arguments as clearly as possible over the next few months.
Liz, you respond to that? All to play for?
It is all to play for, but...
How do you stop complacency in your party?
Well, I don't have any... I'm not saying this because I've been told to say it. I really believe it. Politics is volatile. There's a long way to go. And, if you've been promised a load of things that then haven't been delivered, it's no wonder that people are sceptical. And I know that they are. And that is why I think we have to level with the British public about what we can and cannot do and set out our plan and to work day and night, focused on what they want. And I think this is where we see, for all the ups and downs in politics, and I've learnt, you don't take your highs too high and you don't take your lows too low. You've got to focus on what the public want, and that is the key to getting their trust and support.
Potentially a few more months to go, unless you're going to tell us now. Thanks to Richard Tice for joining us. That's all for us today. Jo Coburn will be back on Monday.